Quadrophenia is Townshend's ode to his youth, growing up as a mod, and what it was like for kids who grew up in that era.
The Who had been a mod band. Apart from Daltrey, it's doubtful that any of the others were really card-carrying mods in terms of Vespers and Lambrettas and stuff. But that was their audience. They knew about those people. They certainly knew about the lifestyle and the drugs they took, the fashions they wore, things like that, because that had been an integral part of the Who's early career.
I think it was Townshend documenting the history of where the band had come from, where they'd started, you know, who their clan was, you know, who their tribe was, you know.
Whether that quite worked in the early 70s, I wasn't so sure, because it was a bit too early, I think, to be reminiscing about that period of the 60s.
Again, you've got the album The Who put out, which is all their songs. Then you've got the soundtrack album, which features most of the Who songs, and then a batch of other tunes that were of the time, sort of to fit in.
The movie of Quadrophenia actually works better than the album does, mainly because the director, Frank Rodham, he simplified the story so that it becomes a tale of mods and rockers and teenage lust, and that works pretty well.
It's a film, whereas Tommy is actually just a rock opera put on celluloid, as it were, with using a lot of filmic devices. This is a film with the soundtrack to it, so that's, I think, why it works. A rock opera is really more intended, I think, for the stage. I think Tommy proves that. The
movie catches the spirit of the mod movement and why it existed and what it was getting away from. That stultifying home life in those tiny little terraced houses where you grew up as an adolescent.
Running about on their motorbikes all hours of the night, I'm not surprised. It's not normal.
In the middle of a nice, quiet piece of scenery and kick him to a pulp.
Oh, yeah? What's normal then?
Let me do it. I've got some new boots I'd like to try out. That's what I like.
What's that?
And just the sheer frustration of living at home. Quadrophenia, the movie, catches that superbly. And the music works very well for it, because the music it's much more of a soundtrack album than it is a rock opera.
Doesn't he look smart?
Oh,
Look at the scooter.
Sting makes for a great ace face in that long leather coat and that sort of sneering look that he could perfect so well.
As an album, it doesn't work quite as well as Tommy does, but as a film, it pisses all over it. But it has some of the best individual songs that The Who ever wrote on it. 5:15, for example, it's, Out of My Brain on the Train. It's just something I think quite a few people can relate to. Love, Rain on Me, The Real Me.
Although I think that musically it is in many ways a better album than Tommy. As a concept it flows better, but actually the production is quite muddy when you listen to it. And it doesn't really bring out the drama of the story, partly because it doesn't really let Roger's voice through enough. Roger's voice is quite low in the mix, and Entwistle's bass is quite high in the mix. So it's a bit off kilter there. And this may be because there are quite a lot of sound effects on the album. In fact, the album is riddled with sound effects one way or another. It's almost more of a soundtrack album than it is a rock and roll or a rock opera album, as it
It did work as an album. It's not my favourite Who record. I mean, I like the fact that it sort of documents a little bit of history, and in fact it was about mods and rockers.
Funnily enough, I listened to Quadrophenia, the album, more than I listened to Tommy. But I think that's probably because it's got better, or it's got more classic Who tunes on it.
And particularly once John Entwistle had remixed it and brought up the dynamics in it, it worked much better.
The Who by Numbers was, I suppose, distinguished by John Entwistle's rather childlike kind of cover design, which he drew himself. And somehow it sort of summed up the album itself. It was rather unsatisfactory.
Who by Numbers is certainly disappointing for me. Yeah, I think for quite a few people. They were having problems by this point. I mean, I think Roger was by now a trout farmer, advertising American Express. Pete was in the throes of heroin addiction. And Keith was losing the plot rapidly, getting up to all sorts of bizarre nonsense with people like Vivian Stanshall and Oliver Reed and anything, basically being a great drummer. And I think that when they got back together to do Who by Numbers, you could hear that the Who weren't actually a great rock band at that point, because they'd all forgotten really what they were about and all the excesses that, you know, they're not unique in this happening to them. All the excesses just got too much, and they specifically Townshend, who they needed as a guiding creative light, had lost sight of really of what was going on and what should have been going on, and you can hear it suffers. It's not a bad record, but it hasn't got many brilliant songs on it.
I liked Who by Numbers. I thought it was a good album, but again, it was an album that I think quite obviously was going to be overshadowed by the success of the previous work or previous works. But it actually is a very, very good album.
Yeah, I mean, it's got the great hit Squeeze Box on it, but I think, you know, they'd done so much. They'd, like any band, and any time I talk about bands, the same thing applies. When we're talking about a very successful band, there has to be breathing space. That breathing space may come due to personal problems, it may come due to financial problems, it may come to tiredness. It may just be that they've run out of steam for a little bit. And certainly in those days still, the record contract was a contract, and it meant you had to deliver a record by a particular date. I think very possibly he'd run out of a little bit of steam. But in a sense, that's okay. It's like, you know, as an audience, we need a little break as well, you know. Because when you look at it in the bigger picture, it's still a great record. Still a great record. It's just perhaps not one of their best, that's all.
Few bands get the recognition they deserve for every album that they put out. So, I mean, there are certain ones, I mean, A Quick One and Sell Out, people might tend to overlook just because of the magnitude of what came after. But I think they're essential documents that, you know, any Who fan will tell you that they're really, really strong records. I think My Generation isn't quite as great as it's made out, but it's got that zeitgeist thing about it. You know, yes, Tommy and Quadrophenia are excessive, but in context with what they were, then perhaps they're not. Who's Next is one of the greatest rock albums of the 70s. By Numbers isn't. And Who Are You is a lot better than people give it credit for.
Who Are You came out of Pete Townshend's somewhat traumatic meeting with the Sex Pistols at the Speakeasy Club one night in 76, 77, when I think one way or another meeting the Sex Pistols made Pete Townshend totally maudlin, because it kind of reinforced to him how old he was. And there were the Sex Pistols trying to venerate him as being the godfather of punk. And of course for poor old Pete that just made him sound old, really. So he landed up getting maudlin and then drunk, and then they had to pull him out of the gutter. But hey, he got a song out of it. And the Who Are You is really, it's addressed to himself. Who am I? What am I doing here? Kind of thing. It's a fitting epitaph for Keith Moon, who just about holds that one together. I mean, it has to be said that on the Who Are You album, his drumming has frankly got pretty sluggish. He couldn't really do it by the end.
It's terrible, really, that Keith Moon died, because you know, it was a sort of it was that through that period where lots of, you know, great rock musicians were dying, and it was pretty much an accident, really. And but yes, it was a fitting swan song in the sense of he went out, you know, after having made a fantastic record, really. So that was good.
Very overlooked. I think the Who by this point were kind of seen as sort of rock dinosaurs. So there is a tendency to kind of ignore Who Are You apart from apart from the title track, because that's still a classic song. And it is, I mean, it showed you they could still write that big rock tune like Won't Get Fooled Again. But there's really interesting music on Who Are You that that shows that you know, they were taking on board what was happening around them. And it's a tragedy that Keith did die, because I think it would have been really interesting to see what they would have come up with after this. I mean, I know they did do face dances with Kenny Jones, but it is quite frankly not a brilliant Who album.
Well, they've gone through all sorts of different formations. I mean, Kenny Jones joined, obviously, after a little bit of time when they were thinking about disbanding or staying together, and they decided to stay together. And of course, Kenny came from the Small Faces and the Faces, so he came from that whole generation. He was a mod as well, so it made logical sense, you know.
And Kenny did very well, I thought, but as it turned out, over the months of touring, it seemed that certainly Roger felt that there was he missed that kind of manic dynamic from Keith. It wasn't there. Something that he probably fought against in their early days. He used to complain bitterly about how noisy their drummer was. It made it tough for him to sing over all this racket. But of course, once it had all gone, he realised that there was that sort of extra dimension to Keith's playing that injected the dynamic energy into the Who. Nobody else could equal that.
The Who, yeah, they have a unique place in rock history for me, definitely.
They are mighty. They are big, meaty and bouncy.